The courtroom fell into a tense silence as Officer Henry Bennett, a white man in his late 30s, leaned back in the witness chair. His smug grin widened with each word he spoke, as if he was savoring every moment of the mockery. He didn't even glance at the young black woman sitting silently at the defense table, her hands tightly gripping the table. Her face remained calm, but her eyes were sharp, as if the words coming from Henry had no effect on her. She even let a slight curl appear on her lips, as though she knew something that no one else in the room did. As Henry pointed dramatically toward her, his actions were full of disdain, making the air thick with tension. The way he gestured toward her, demeaning her with every word, caused several people in the gallery to avert their eyes, unable to witness such humiliation. Henry's voice echoed again, filled with mockery. "Your Honor, it's clear this defendant doesn't belong in civilized society. Just look at her." His words were spat out with the intention of degrading her, pushing the limits of how far he could go without hesitation. The young woman remained silent. She didn't react to the insults, instead tightening her jaw slightly, maintaining her composure. But if anyone looked closely enough, they could see the flicker of something beneath the calm, something sharp, something dangerous, like she was preparing to do something no one in the room expected. The tension in the room grew, with everyone waiting for the next move, wondering how far Henry would take it. Despite the public humiliation, the woman showed no sign of weakness. She held her head high, her gaze intense, staring directly at Henry, as if seeing through every word he uttered. She made no attempt to argue, no attempt to defend herself. She simply held her ground. In that moment, it was clear. This was no longer just a courtroom battle. It was something much bigger. Henry's confidence was starting to waver, although he tried to hold on to his composure. There was something in the woman's gaze, something steady and unwavering, that unsettled him. He had never expected her to be so unfazed, so silent in the face of his mockery. His usual confidence was slowly slipping away, and the realization began to dawn on him that he was no longer in control of the situation. The room remained silent, everyone now caught in the unsettling tension. The young woman was no longer the frightened defendant from a year ago. She was someone else entirely, someone with a purpose, someone who had been preparing for this very moment. As the silence grew, it became clear that Henry's words had not the desired effect. Instead, they had inadvertently sharpened the focus on the woman sitting across from him. Months earlier, in a modest law office on the outskirts of town, a young black woman, freshly graduated from law school, sat hunched over a pile of case files. Her eyes, though tired, remained sharp with determination as she meticulously reviewed every document in front of her. Emma Parker, in her mid-20s, had fought hard to earn her degree, and now that she had it, she was determined to prove herself in a world that didn't make it easy for someone like her to succeed. The hours were long, the pay almost non-existent, but she didn't care. This was her shot, and she wasn't going to let it slip by. The small office she worked in, tucked away on the edge of town, was often quiet, save for the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead and the occasional clink of a coffee cup being set down. It wasn't much, but it was hers. As she flipped through another case file, the weight of the legal work before her began to settle on her shoulders, the pressure mounting. She knew she couldn't afford any mistakes. Her reputation, her future, depended on this case. The defendant, a woman accused of shoplifting, had a thin case against her, but it was the testimony of the arresting officer, the very same officer who had humiliated Emma in court a year ago, that could decide everything. Emma paused for a moment, her fingers lightly tapping the file in front of her. The memories of that fateful day, the day she had been arrested by Officer Henry Bennett, flooded her mind once more. She could still hear the echoes of his mocking voice, feel the sting of his words as he tore apart her character in front of the entire courtroom. That was the day she had vowed to never let anyone have that kind of power over her again. That was the day her transformation began. She had been on the wrong side of the law, a defendant, humiliated by a man who thought he was better than her simply because of the badge he wore. The experience had torn her apart, but it had also fueled something inside her, a burning desire for justice, not just for herself, but for everyone who had been treated unfairly by the system. She couldn't let Henry Bennett, or anyone like him, get away with their actions. She would make sure no one else had to go through what she did. And that was why, after months of study, late nights, and relentless work, Emma was now sitting at her desk, ready to face the man who had destroyed her dignity. Only this time, she would be in the position of power. As the clock ticked past midnight, her phone buzzed on the desk, breaking her concentration. It was Sarah, her best friend, checking in again. Sarah's concern was genuine, but Emma couldn't afford to let anything distract her. Not now. She was so close to securing a victory for her client, but her friend's voice was warm, and Emma couldn't help but listen. "I know you're busy," Sarah said, her voice soft but tinged with concern. "But Emma, you've been working nonstop. You need a break." "I can't, Sarah," Emma replied, her voice steady despite the exhaustion pulling at her. "This case is important. If I don't get this right, my client could lose everything." "I get that," Sarah said, the concern still clear. "But you've been through so much. Don't forget to take care of yourself, okay?" Emma smiled, even though the weight of the case felt heavier with every passing minute. "Thanks, Sarah. I'll try." But deep down, she knew that she wouldn't be able to take a break. Not until this case was over. Her gaze drifted back to the case file in front of her. The words on the pages blurred together as her mind wandered back to that day. The day she was humiliated in court. The day she vowed to rise above. That was the moment she decided to fight back. She had spent months training herself to be the lawyer she needed to be. To never again be the powerless woman who sat in the defendant's chair. And now, here she was, poised to take down the man who had treated her like dirt. She would fight with everything she had to ensure that the world would see the truth. Emma had come a long way from that day of humiliation, and she wasn't about to let anyone take away what she had worked so hard to build. She was determined to win this case, not just for her client, but for herself. She had something to prove. As the night stretched on, Emma continued to pore over her notes, her eyes flicking back and forth between the case files and the list of witnesses she had to call. She had everything she needed. All she had to do now was execute her plan. Every question, every argument had to be perfect. There was no room for error. She was going to walk into that courtroom with all the confidence she had worked so hard to build. And she would take Henry Bennett down. It was no longer just about the case. It was personal. Across town, Henry Bennett was finishing his shift at the police department. The rising star of the force, Henry had a reputation for being confident, sharp-witted, and just a little too smug for his own good. He liked being the center of attention, the one people turned to when they needed answers. But his reputation wasn't entirely spotless. There were rumors about his harsh treatment of certain individuals, about his tendency to belittle those he considered beneath him. Henry had always brushed it off. After all, he was just doing his job, right? But there was something about this case, about the woman he had mocked in court, that was starting to bother him. That night, he was assigned to patrol a quieter part of town. His shift was almost over, and he was tired of the usual routine. He wanted something interesting to happen. So, when he saw a beat-up sedan with a broken taillight, he pulled it over, eager for the chance to get one more check-in before heading home. Inside the car sat a young Latino man, his hands gripping the steering wheel, his nervousness clear. Henry smirked as he approached, shining his flashlight into the car. "Evening," he said with a fake politeness. "License and registration, please." The man fumbled for his documents, his anxiety palpable. Henry couldn't resist the opportunity to make him squirm. "Relax, buddy. It's just a broken taillight. Unless you've got something to hide?" The man, shaking, handed over his documents. Henry ran them through his system, finding nothing suspicious. Still, he couldn't resist making a few snide comments, digging into the man as much as he could. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Henry let the man go with a wave of his hand, still chuckling to himself as he watched the car drive off. What Henry didn't realize, however, was that his arrogance, his treatment of the young man, was just a small example of the behavior that had already set the stage for a much bigger confrontation, one that would change his life forever. The following morning, the courtroom was packed with a mixture of anticipation and tension. The trial was officially underway, and the first day had already set the tone for what would undoubtedly be a long and difficult battle. Officer Henry Bennett sat in his seat, his usual confident smirk now replaced by a subtle unease that he couldn't shake off. The young black woman who had once been on the other side of the courtroom was now sitting across from him, poised, sharp, and prepared in a way he had never expected. Emma Parker, the young attorney who had once been humiliated in front of the entire town, was no longer the scared woman from the past. She had transformed into someone powerful, someone capable of taking him down. Henry tried to focus on the case at hand, but the nagging feeling that something was off persisted in the back of his mind. He had faced skilled lawyers before, but Emma was different. Her questions were precise, her arguments clear, and she seemed to be everywhere at once, catching him off guard with every turn. He had underestimated her before, but now, as she tore through his testimony, making him sweat under the weight of her scrutiny, he realized just how wrong he had been. Emma was relentless. Every question she asked, every piece of evidence she presented, chipped away at his confidence. It wasn't just about the case. It was personal. For Emma, this trial wasn't just about holding Henry Bennett accountable for his actions. It was about something deeper, something that had been festering inside her for months. This was her chance to show everyone, and especially Henry, that she was no longer the powerless woman he had mocked. She was in control now, and she wasn't going to let him forget it. The court proceedings continued for hours, and by the end of the day, Henry was exhausted. He had always prided himself on being able to handle tough situations, but this was different. Every time he thought he had the upper hand, Emma managed to pull the rug out from under him. The tension in the courtroom was palpable, and Henry could feel the eyes of everyone in the room on him. The reporters in the back, the spectators in the gallery, they were all waiting to see how he would respond to the relentless assault on his credibility. When the judge called for a brief recess, Henry quickly retreated to the hallway, his face flushed with frustration. The moment the doors slammed behind him, he was swarmed by reporters, their cameras flashing and their questions bombarding him from every direction. He forced a tight smile, trying to maintain his composure, but the questions about his conduct and the potential misconduct charges weighed heavily on him. "Officer Bennett, how do you feel about today's proceedings?" one reporter asked, his voice sharp. "No comment," Henry muttered, pushing his way through the crowd, desperate to get some space. He was seething. How had he gotten himself into this situation? And who was this woman, Emma Parker, who seemed so prepared to dismantle him at every turn? He couldn't stop thinking about her, about the fire in her eyes, the way she seemed to be in complete control of the courtroom. Emma, for her part, stood in the hallway outside the courtroom, her expression unreadable as she watched the chaos unfold around Henry. She had expected him to be rattled, but seeing it in person gave her a strange sense of satisfaction. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she was in the right place, doing the right thing. She wasn't just fighting for justice in a legal sense, she was fighting for herself, for the dignity that had been stripped away from her by this man. As Henry disappeared into the crowd, Emma turned back toward the courtroom, her mind racing. This trial wasn't just a chance to win a case, it was a chance to prove something to herself, to show the world that she was no longer the woman who had been humiliated and mocked. She had spent so long preparing for this moment, imagining all the things she would say if she ever saw Henry again. But now that it was happening, she felt an odd mixture of satisfaction and exhaustion. The emotional weight of it all was beginning to settle in, but she couldn't afford to let it affect her judgment. The trial was far from over, and she had to stay focused. Back inside the courtroom, the second day of the trial began. Emma called her first witness to the stand, a young Latino man who had filed a complaint against Officer Bennett a year earlier. The man hesitated as he took the stand, clearly nervous about reliving the experience, but Emma's tone was gentle, empathetic. She asked him to describe what had happened during the traffic stop that had escalated unnecessarily. As he spoke, his voice shaking, the courtroom fell into a heavy silence. "I was just trying to get home," the young man said, his hands trembling as he recalled the encounter. "I didn't do anything wrong, but Officer Bennett, he kept accusing me of hiding something, even after he searched my car. He humiliated me in front of everyone." Emma's eyes never left the young man as he spoke. She could feel the weight of his words, the pain that still lingered from that day. She had heard similar stories from other people who had been treated unfairly by Officer Bennett, and she knew that this wasn't an isolated incident. This was part of a pattern of behavior, a culture of abuse that Henry had been allowed to perpetuate for far too long. As she turned her attention back to Henry, she saw him shift uncomfortably in his seat. The confident swagger he had worn at the beginning of the trial was nowhere to be found now. He looked uneasy, vulnerable, as if the weight of the testimony was starting to sink in. Emma didn't let up. She pressed on, asking the young man more questions, drawing out the details of the encounter, making sure the jury understood just how much damage Henry's behavior had caused. Henry, for his part, was starting to feel the heat. His lawyer had tried to discredit the witness, pointing out minor inconsistencies in his statement. But Emma was prepared. She countered with evidence that supported the young man's claims, painting a clear picture of a man who had abused his authority, who had used his badge not as a shield, but as a weapon. The jury was paying attention, and Henry could feel their eyes on him. The tables were turning, and he didn't know how to stop it. The tension in the room was palpable, but Emma remained calm, focused. She had been preparing for this moment for months, and now that she was finally here, she wasn't about to let it slip away. Every word she spoke, every piece of evidence she presented, brought her one step closer to holding Henry Bennett accountable for his actions. But she knew that this wasn't just about winning a case. This was about something far bigger. A chance to show that no one, not even someone in a position of power, was above the law. The days blurred together as the trial continued. Each day, Emma walked into the courtroom with a sense of determination that never wavered. The case was slowly turning in her favor, but there was still so much to prove. She knew that the hardest part was yet to come. As the days wore on, Emma's exhaustion began to show. She had spent sleepless nights poring over case files, strategizing her next move, making sure that every question she asked, every piece of evidence she presented, was calculated to land the perfect blow to Officer Henry Bennett's defense. Henry, on the other hand, seemed to be crumbling under the pressure. His usual confidence had given way to uncertainty, and he found himself questioning everything. He had expected this trial to be just another routine case, another notch in his belt, but it had quickly become something far more personal. The young black woman who had once been on the other side of the courtroom, the one he had humiliated so easily, was now the one who was relentlessly attacking his credibility. Every time he thought he had regained control, she would strike again, this time with more precision, more force. The courtroom, once a place where he held all the power, now felt suffocating. Every time he spoke, he could feel Emma's eyes on him, sharp and calculating, as if she was reading his every move. She wasn't just a lawyer trying to win a case. She was someone who had been deeply affected by his actions, and now she was determined to make him pay. The tension between them was palpable, and it was starting to get to Henry. He couldn't shake the feeling that Emma was more than just a skilled attorney. She was someone who had a personal stake in this trial, someone who had been wronged and was now fighting to make sure he paid for it. But as much as Henry tried to resist, he couldn't deny the growing sense of guilt that gnawed at him. Every time Emma questioned a witness, every time she presented evidence of his misconduct, he felt the weight of his actions bearing down on him. He had always prided himself on his ability to remain unaffected by the stories of people he had wronged. But this time, it was different. This time, the pain was too close to home. The memories of his past behavior, the people he had humiliated, the lives he had ruined, all of it was crashing down on him. One afternoon, as the trial progressed, Emma called a new witness to the stand. It was a woman in her early 40s, her face etched with years of pain and hardship. Clara Peterson, a mother and a small business owner, had been the victim of one of Henry's many unjust stops. Her story was devastating. Clara had been shopping at a local grocery store when Officer Bennett had stopped her for no reason, accusing her of stealing, even though she had done nothing wrong. Clara's voice trembled as she recounted the humiliation she had suffered that day. She spoke of how Henry had belittled her in front of the store's customers, how he had searched her bags and interrogated her without cause. Emma's questions were gentle, but firm. She asked Clara to describe the impact that the experience had on her, how it had made her feel. Clara's voice cracked as she explained that the incident had shattered her sense of trust in the police. "I felt like I was guilty of something I hadn't even done," Clara said, her eyes filling with tears. "It made me afraid to go to the store, afraid to be out in public. I started to look over my shoulder, wondering if another officer would stop me for no reason." The courtroom was silent as Clara's testimony sank in. Emma could see the jury's expressions shift. They were no longer just hearing the words. They were feeling the weight of Clara's pain. They were beginning to understand the long-lasting effects of Henry's actions. For Henry, it was a moment of reckoning. He had been so sure that his behavior was justified, so confident that the people he had wronged were just a small part of the bigger picture. But as Clara spoke, something inside him shifted. For the first time in his life, he was forced to confront the reality of what he had done. He had hurt people. He had destroyed their trust. He had taken away their dignity. As Clara finished her testimony, Emma turned to Henry. She didn't need to say anything. Her eyes spoke volumes. She was holding him accountable. She was showing the world exactly who he was. a man who had used his badge to harm others, to destroy their lives with impunity. Henry's face had gone pale. He could feel the sweat starting to form on his brow. He didn't know how to respond. He had always prided himself on being in control, on being able to navigate any situation with ease. But now, with Clara's words hanging in the air, he felt like a child. He had no defense. There was nothing he could say that would take back the harm he had caused. He had crossed a line, and now there was no turning back. The courtroom remained silent for what felt like an eternity. Henry shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his mind racing. He knew that the evidence against him was mounting, and that there was nothing he could do to stop it. The momentum of the trial was shifting away from him, and he was powerless to stop it. He looked over at Emma, but she was focused, calm, as if she had expected all of this to unfold. As the trial continued, Henry's discomfort only grew. Each witness that Emma called to the stand seemed to add another nail in his coffin. One after another, people who had been wronged by him, people who had suffered because of his actions, took the stand and shared their stories. A young woman who had been harassed by him during a routine stop. A man who had been falsely accused of drug possession. The pattern was clear, and it was undeniable. Henry's lawyer tried to fight back, tried to discredit the witnesses, but it was no use. The truth had already been laid bare, and there was no way to deny it. As the defense continued to crumble, Henry began to realize just how deeply he had misjudged the situation. He had thought that he could get away with it. He had thought that his reputation, his power, would protect him. But now, as Emma's relentless pursuit of justice continued to tear down his defenses, he could feel the walls closing in on him. That evening, after the trial adjourned for the day, Henry found himself sitting alone in his car, staring blankly at the steering wheel. His mind was racing, and he couldn't shake the feeling that everything he had built, his career, his reputation, his sense of self, was falling apart. The guilt was overwhelming. He had never thought about the consequences of his actions until now. He had never considered the people he had hurt, the lives he had destroyed. But now, it was all coming back to him, and he didn't know how to fix it. As he sat there, lost in thought, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Mike, his longtime colleague and friend. Mike had been with him through thick and thin, and Henry knew he could always count on him. "Hey man, you good?" the message read. Henry stared at the screen for a moment before typing out a response. "I don't know, Mike. This trial, it's messing with me. I don't know how to handle this." Mike's response was quick. "Don't let it get to you. Emma's just doing her job. You've got this." But Henry wasn't so sure. He didn't feel like he had it anymore. As the weight of his actions pressed down on him, he knew that something had to change. But what? He couldn't keep running from the truth. The next day, the trial resumed, but the air in the courtroom was different. Henry's confidence was gone, replaced by a quiet sense of dread. Emma called her next witness, a former colleague of Henry's, and as the man took the stand, Henry couldn't help but feel like everything he had worked for was slipping away. He wasn't just facing a lawyer anymore, he was facing the consequences of his own actions. The trial continued its unrelenting pace. Each day, Emma stood firm, her resolve as unshakable as the stone walls of the courtroom that encased her. Every argument she presented, every piece of evidence she meticulously laid out, chipped away at Officer Henry Bennett's defenses. His arrogance, his confident demeanor, had slowly been stripped away to reveal a man on the edge of unraveling. No longer was he the officer who stood tall, exuding control and certainty. Now, He was a man drowning in his own guilt, forced to confront the truth of his actions. Actions that had caused harm to so many, and not just the people he had wronged in the past, but also his own reputation, his own career. The courtroom had become a battleground. Henry had once believed that the law was his ally, that the badge he wore protected him from consequences. But now, with each witness called to the stand, each testimony that exposed his misconduct, Henry began to realize that no one was above the law. Not even him. The realization hit him harder than anything he had felt before. He had lived his life under the misguided belief that he could wield his power without consequence. But Emma had come into his life like a force of nature, and with each word she spoke, she tore down the walls of denial he had built around himself. That afternoon, Emma called her next witness, a former colleague of Henry's, a woman named Lisa Rodriguez, who had worked as an administrative assistant at the same precinct where Henry had served. Lisa was nervous as she took the stand. She had never spoken out about the things she had witnessed in the precinct, but she knew that this trial was too important to stay silent. She had seen firsthand how Henry treated the people he considered beneath him. She had witnessed the way he belittled vulnerable individuals, dismissing their concerns as though they were inconsequential. But she had never had the courage to speak up. Until now. Lisa looked across the courtroom at Henry, her gaze hesitant, yet firm. She was about to speak the truth, and no matter how uncomfortable it made her, she knew it was time. Emma, standing before her, nodded reassuringly, signaling her to begin. "Miss Rodriguez," Emma began, her voice calm but intense, "can you tell the court about your experiences working with Officer Bennett?" Lisa hesitated for a moment, her hands shaking slightly as she adjusted her glasses. "I worked at the precinct for several years," she began, her voice wavering at first, but growing steadier with each word. "I assisted with paperwork, scheduling, and filing reports for officers. Officer Bennett was one of the more prominent officers at the precinct. He was always very confident, very sure of himself. But sometimes his behavior was troubling." Emma leaned forward, her gaze unwavering. "What do you mean by troubling, Miss Rodriguez?" Lisa swallowed hard before continuing, her voice tight with the weight of her words. "There were times when he would treat certain individuals with a lack of respect. People who came in to report crimes. People who were just trying to do the right thing. He would dismiss them, make them feel like they were wasting his time. I saw it happen more than once." Emma's expression never changed, but her mind was racing. This was the evidence she needed to drive the point home. She had already shown that Henry abused his power when it came to traffic stops and interactions with civilians. Now, Lisa's testimony would shed light on the deeper issues within the precinct. It wasn't just Henry. There was a culture of disrespect, of dismissiveness, that was being fostered by officers who thought they were above reproach. She pressed on, her voice soft but insistent. "Can you give an example of a time when you witnessed this behavior?" Lisa hesitated again, but then her face hardened, her resolve firming. "There was a woman who came to the precinct to report harassment. She was visibly distressed, and she was asking for help. But Officer Bennett told her she was exaggerating, that she was just being dramatic. He told her to stop wasting police time, and then he told her to leave. I could see she was upset, but he didn't care. He just dismissed her." Emma's eyes flicked toward Henry, whose face was now unreadable. Lisa's words were powerful, but they were only part of the story. There was more. Much more. And she was going to make sure the jury understood the full extent of Henry's behavior. "How did you feel when you saw this happen, Miss Rodriguez?" Emma asked, her voice softer now, coaxing the emotion out of Lisa's testimony. Lisa's voice cracked slightly as she spoke. It was heartbreaking. I wanted to say something, but I didn't feel like I could. The culture there didn't encourage us to speak out against the officers. We were supposed to just do our jobs and keep our heads down. But it wasn't right. It wasn't fair to the people who were just trying to get help. The room was silent. The weight of Lisa's words hung in the air, and Emma allowed the silence to stretch for a moment before she spoke again. "Thank you, Miss Rodriguez. No further questions." Lisa nodded, her face flushed with the effort of telling her story. She had done the right thing, and now it was up to the jury to decide whether they would believe her. Emma returned to her seat, her heart racing. The evidence was stacking up, the case was progressing, but there was still a long way to go. She knew she had to remain focused. She couldn't afford to let her emotions cloud her judgment. As the trial broke for a brief recess, Henry sat in his seat, his mind whirling. He couldn't stop thinking about Lisa's testimony. It was undeniable. The way she had described his behavior, the way she had painted him as someone who had no regard for the people he was supposed to protect. He had always believed that he was doing the right thing, that his actions were justified. But now, as he sat there in that courtroom, he began to wonder if he had been wrong all along. Henry's lawyer, a seasoned attorney with years of experience in handling high-profile cases, leaned in close, his voice low and urgent. "This isn't looking good, Henry," he said, his eyes flicking toward the jury. "We need to turn this around. You need to get a handle on this situation. You're losing control." Henry didn't answer. He couldn't. His mind was a whirlpool of conflicting emotions: guilt, shame, frustration. He had tried to dismiss it all, to bury the doubt deep inside, but now it was rising to the surface, impossible to ignore. "I'll handle it," Henry finally muttered, though he didn't believe his own words. His voice lacked the confidence it had once carried. The facade of the self-assured officer was beginning to crack, and he couldn't stop it. Across the room, Emma watched the exchange between Henry and his lawyer. She could see the tension in Henry's body, the way he was trying to mask his discomfort. But she also knew that the cracks were showing, that he was beginning to understand the gravity of his situation. For the first time, Henry wasn't the one in control. Emma had taken the reins, and she wasn't going to let go until she had seen justice done. As the recess ended and the courtroom settled back into its tense atmosphere, Emma prepared to call the next witness. She knew that this was only the beginning. There was still much more to come, but with each passing day, she was one step closer to holding Officer Henry Bennett accountable for his actions. The trial had reached a pivotal moment, and Emma knew that the stakes were higher than ever. The tension in the courtroom had grown unbearable. Each piece of evidence she presented, each witness she called to the stand, painting a more damning picture of Officer Henry Bennett. As the days passed, Emma could feel the weight of the case pressing down on her. The pressure to deliver justice for her clients, to stand up for the people who had been wronged by this officer, was immense, but she refused to buckle under it. Every day she stepped into the courtroom, she was more determined to see this through to the end. Henry, on the other hand, was crumbling. The confident officer who had once seemed untouchable was now a man who couldn't shake the weight of his guilt. The testimonies, the evidence, and the unrelenting scrutiny were beginning to break him down. He had never expected things to escalate like this. At first, he had thought the trial would be a simple matter, a mere formality in his career. But now, as Emma continued to expose the truth, he found himself questioning everything he had ever known. He could feel the eyes of the jury on him, the weight of their judgment pressing in from all sides. As the trial moved into its final days, Emma decided to call her next witness, someone who would provide the final piece of the puzzle. She had been waiting for this moment, the opportunity to bring the truth to light once and for all. The witness she had chosen was someone who had witnessed Henry's actions firsthand, someone who had seen the way he had abused his power and treated others with disdain. It was someone from Henry's own past, someone who had worked alongside him in the precinct and knew him better than anyone else. Emma stood before the judge, her voice steady and confident as she addressed the court. "Your Honor, I would like to call Thomas Grant to the stand." The name hung in the air like a weight, and a ripple of murmurs ran through the courtroom. Thomas Grant, a former lieutenant at the same precinct where Henry had served, had always been a respected figure in law enforcement. He was known for his integrity, his commitment to justice, and his no-nonsense approach to policing. For years, he had been Henry's superior, guiding him, mentoring him, and shaping his career. But Thomas had also seen something darker in Henry, a side of him that he couldn't ignore. As Thomas stepped up to the witness stand, Henry's heart sank. He hadn't seen Thomas in years, but the older man's presence was unmistakable. He was still the same, a towering figure of authority, his face stern and resolute. Henry couldn't meet his gaze. Instead, he stared down at his hands, feeling the weight of his past mistakes pressing down on him. He had known that this day would come. He had known that someone like Thomas, someone with a strong sense of justice, would eventually be forced to speak out. But now that it was happening, he realized just how much he had underestimated the power of the truth. Emma approached the stand, her posture calm and collected. "Mr. Grant," she began, "can you please tell the court your relationship with Officer Henry Bennett?" Thomas nodded, his eyes briefly flicking toward Henry before focusing on Emma. "I served as lieutenant in the precinct where Officer Bennett worked. I was his supervisor for about 5 years. During your time working together, did you witness any behavior that you felt was problematic?" Emma's voice was steady, her eyes locked on Thomas as she waited for his response. Thomas hesitated for a moment, his gaze flicking between Emma and Henry. Finally, he spoke, his voice firm. "Yes. There were several times when Officer Bennett overstepped his bounds. He was ambitious, and he wanted to rise through the ranks quickly. But sometimes, that ambition led to mistakes that I had to address." Emma leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. "Can you be more specific? What kind of mistakes are you referring to?" Thomas sighed, the weight of the memories clearly affecting him. There were times when he used excessive force, when he made assumptions about people based on their appearance or demeanor. He was quick to judge, quick to escalate situations, and that's not how we were trained to handle things. I had to remind him several times that our job was to protect people, not intimidate them. The room was silent as Thomas's words hung in the air. Emma's heart raced as she processed what she was hearing. This was it, the final confirmation of everything she had suspected. Henry Bennett was not the man he had always claimed to be. He was someone who had used his position of power to hurt others, someone who had disregarded the very principles of law enforcement in pursuit of his own ambitions. "And did you ever witness any specific incidents where Officer Bennett crossed the line?" Emma's voice was sharp, her eyes fixed on Thomas, urging him to continue. Thomas nodded slowly. "There was one incident that stands out. Officer Bennett stopped a young man for a minor traffic violation. He accused the man of being under the influence, even though there was no evidence to support that claim. The situation escalated quickly. Bennett detained the man for hours, questioning him without cause, searching his car repeatedly, and even threatening to bring him up on charges for something he hadn't done. In the end, the man was released, but the damage had already been done. He filed a complaint, but it went nowhere. Bennett knew how to cover his tracks. Emma's expression darkened. This was the moment she had been waiting for. The truth was out. Henry had abused his power, manipulated the system, and hurt countless people along the way. She turned to the jury, her voice steady as she addressed them. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this is the man we are dealing with. A man who used his badge not as a shield to protect the public, but as a weapon to harm and intimidate. A man who manipulated the system to avoid facing the consequences of his actions." She paused for a moment, letting the weight of her words sink in before continuing. "But today, we have a chance to hold him accountable. We have a chance to ensure that no one else suffers at the hands of a man who believed that he could get away with anything. We have a chance to make sure that justice is served." The room was heavy with silence as Emma's words reverberated through the courtroom. She could feel the eyes of the jury on her, their gazes steady and unwavering. Henry's face was pale, and he couldn't bring himself to look at the jury, at Emma, or even at Thomas. He had been exposed, and there was no escaping it now. As the day came to a close, the courtroom buzzed with anticipation. The witnesses had spoken, the evidence had been presented, and now it was up to the jury to decide Henry's fate. Emma knew that the battle was far from over, but she couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. She had fought for justice, for the truth, and now the pieces were falling into place. That night, Emma sat at her desk, exhausted but resolute. She had done everything she could to ensure that Officer Henry Bennett faced the consequences of his actions. Now, it was in the hands of the jury. As she reviewed her notes one final time, her phone buzzed, interrupting her thoughts. It was a text from Sarah, her best friend. "I saw the news," Sarah's message read. "You're doing amazing. Keep going. You've got this." Emma smiled softly as she read the message. She had come so far, and no matter what happened, she knew that she had done everything in her power to make sure that the truth prevailed. The trial was almost over, but the journey was just beginning. The days following the testimony of Thomas Grant were filled with a sense of tension and anticipation that seemed to hang in the air like a storm cloud. The trial had reached its climax. Every piece of evidence had been laid out. Every witness had told their story, and now all that was left was the final battle, the closing arguments. Emma had prepared herself for this moment for months. She knew that this was her chance to make the final push, to ensure that justice would be served. As the trial resumed for the final stretch, the room seemed even quieter than usual. The weight of the decision that the jury was about to make hung heavily on everyone present. Henry Bennett sat in his chair, his once confident posture now slumped and defeated. His face was pale, and his eyes had lost their usual sharpness. He looked like a man who had been stripped of everything, who had been exposed for who he truly was. The smug, self-assured officer that had once sat in this courtroom believing he was untouchable was now a shell of that person. His future was uncertain, and he had no idea what was about to come next. Emma, on the other hand, sat tall, her gaze fixed on the front of the courtroom, her mind sharp and focused. This was her moment. She had come so far, and despite the fatigue that was beginning to settle in her bones, she wasn't going to let it show. She had prepared for this day, for this fight, and now she was ready to make her case one final time. This was more than just about winning a trial. This was about making sure that the officer who had abused his power and destroyed lives would be held accountable. It was about showing the world that no one, not even those in positions of power, was above the law. As the judge called for the closing arguments, the courtroom fell silent. Henry's defense attorney stood first, his voice firm as he began his final push to sway the jury in his favor. He spoke of Henry's years of service, his commitment to law enforcement, and the many lives he had protected. He tried to paint a picture of a man who had simply made a few mistakes, someone who had let his ambition cloud his judgment, but who had always intended to do good. He called on the jury to consider the bigger picture, to see Henry as a person, not just as the sum of his mistakes. Henry's attorney had always been a master of deflection, of trying to paint the narrative in a way that favored his client. But Emma could see through it. She knew that the defense was grasping at straws. The truth had been exposed, and there was no going back. She had seen through Henry's facade, and now it was time to ensure that the jury saw him for what he truly was. A man who had abused his position of power to harm others without consequence. Emma stood up slowly, her expression unreadable as she prepared to deliver her closing argument. She had been waiting for this moment, and now she would make it count. She took a deep breath and addressed the jury, her voice clear and unwavering. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, her tone steady, "what we have seen here in this courtroom is not a story about mistakes, not a story about a few isolated incidents. This is a story about a man who used his power to hurt others, a man who abused his badge to intimidate, humiliate, and belittle those who were simply trying to live their lives. Officer Henry Bennett stands before you today, not as a hero, not as a protector, but as a man who has broken the trust of the people he swore to serve." She paused for a moment, allowing the weight of her words to sink in before continuing. "We have heard from witness after witness, people whose lives were shattered by Henry's actions. A young man, falsely accused and humiliated during a routine traffic stop. A mother, falsely accused of theft in front of her children. A woman, dismissed when she came to the precinct for help, her suffering ignored. And yet, Officer Bennett has shown no remorse, no acknowledgement of the harm he has caused. Instead, he has attempted to deflect, to make excuses for his behavior, as though the lives he ruined are simply collateral damage in his rise to power." Emma's gaze swept across the jury, her eyes locking with theirs as she spoke. But this case is not about sympathy for Officer Bennett. It is not about his career or his ambitions. This case is about justice. It is about ensuring that the actions of those in power do not go unchecked, that the people who are entrusted with the responsibility of protecting us are held accountable when they fail to do so. She turned slightly, addressing Henry directly for the first time in her closing argument. "Officer Bennett, you are not above the law. Your actions have consequences, and those consequences cannot be swept under the rug. We cannot allow you to continue hurting others, to continue using your badge as a weapon of oppression. Today, you have the chance to make things right. But the first step toward making it right is acknowledging the harm you've caused." The room was silent as Emma's words hung in the air. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. This was it. The trial had come to a close, and now it was in the jury's hands. But Emma was confident. She had done everything she could. She had fought for justice, for truth, and for the people who had been harmed by Officer Bennett's actions. She finished her closing argument, her voice steady and resolute. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, it is time to hold Officer Bennett accountable for his actions. It is time for justice to be served, and it is time for this man to face the consequences of his abuse of power." Emma turned and took her seat, her heart pounding in her chest as she looked toward the jury. She knew that the final decision was out of her hands now, but she had done everything she could to ensure that the right outcome would prevail. Henry sat in his seat, his hands clenched tightly in his lap. He couldn't shake the feeling that everything he had worked for was slipping through his fingers. He had spent his entire career trying to prove himself, trying to rise through the ranks. But now, all of that felt meaningless. The facade he had built around himself, the reputation he had crafted, was crumbling. He couldn't hide from the truth anymore. He had hurt people. He had used his power to destroy lives. And now, he was facing the consequences. As the jury deliberated, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. Reporters, spectators, and even the judge himself seemed to be waiting with bated breath for the verdict. Emma sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap, her mind racing. She had given everything to this case, and now all she could do was wait. She had done her part. She had fought for justice. The rest was out of her hands. The courtroom remained tense, a heavy silence hanging in the air as the jury deliberated. Emma's eyes were fixed on the empty space where the jury had once sat, but now the room felt as though it were suspended in time, as if every person in the room was holding their breath, waiting for the moment that would decide everything. The weeks of testimony, the emotional weight of every witness, every piece of evidence, all of it had led to this point. And now Emma could only sit, her hands folded tightly in her lap, trying to maintain her composure as the jury deliberated on the fate of Officer Henry Bennett. For what felt like hours, Emma's mind raced, replaying every moment of the trial, every word spoken, every piece of evidence presented. She had fought with everything she had, every ounce of her energy, every shred of her resolve had gone into this case. She had exposed the truth, and she had done everything within her power to ensure that justice would prevail. But now, she couldn't help but feel the weight of the uncertainty pressing down on her. Would the jury see it the way she did? Would they understand the gravity of Henry's actions? Or would they be swayed by his reputation, his years of service in law enforcement? Across the room, Henry sat in his chair, his face pale and drawn. The once confident officer, who had strutted into the courtroom with an air of superiority, now seemed like a man at the end of his rope. His posture was slumped, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. He stared at the floor, unable to look anyone in the eye. The trial had stripped him of his confidence, his arrogance, his sense of control. The man who had once believed he was above reproach was now a man who had been thoroughly exposed for the world to see. And the truth was undeniable. Henry's mind was a whirlwind. He had never imagined that things would come to this point. He had always believed that his badge, his authority, would shield him from the consequences of his actions. But now, as the trial unfolded and the evidence mounted against him, he realized that he had made a terrible mistake. He had hurt so many people, people who trusted him to protect them. And for what? His own selfish ambition, his desire for power, had clouded his judgment. And now he was paying the price. He could hear the faint sound of murmurs in the courtroom, the shuffle of papers, the soft footsteps of the bailiff moving quietly in and out of the room. But all of it felt distant, as though he were trapped in a bubble of his own thoughts. He had been sitting there for what felt like an eternity, waiting for the moment when the jury would return with their verdict. And in that moment, he realized that he wasn't just waiting for the decision of a jury. He was waiting for the decision of his own fate. The future that he had once thought was so certain, so secure, was now hanging by a thread. And the thread was rapidly unraveling. The minutes stretched into what felt like hours, and Emma could feel the tension building, the anticipation weighing on everyone in the room. She glanced around, her eyes briefly meeting those of the judge, who sat at the bench, his expression stern, unreadable. The silence seemed to deepen, and Emma's heart pounded in her chest. She knew that whatever came next would change everything. She had spent so long preparing for this moment, but now that it was here, she couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. It wasn't fear, not exactly, but it was something deeper, something that she couldn't quite name. And then, finally, the door to the jury room opened. The foreman, a middle-aged man with graying hair, stepped forward, holding a piece of paper in his hand. He walked toward the judge, the entire room watching in anticipation, every eye fixed on him. The air in the room was so thick with tension that it felt as though the entire building was holding its breath. The foreman handed the paper to the judge, who nodded and motioned for the courtroom to rise. "Ladies and gentlemen," the judge's voice echoed through the silent room, "the jury has reached a verdict." Emma's heart skipped a beat as she stood, her eyes fixed on the judge. The moment she had been waiting for was finally here. The moment that would decide the fate of Officer Henry Bennett, the man who had once humiliated her, the man who had torn apart so many lives with his abuse of power. The judge cleared his throat, unfolding the piece of paper. "In the matter of the civil suit against Officer Henry Bennett for misconduct, we find in favor of the plaintiff." A rush of emotions flooded through Emma. The words felt like a weight being lifted off her shoulders, the culmination of everything she had worked for. She had done it. She had fought for justice, for the truth, and now the world would see that no one was above the law, not even Officer Henry Bennett. She could feel her chest tighten, her breath catching in her throat as she tried to process the reality of what had just happened. The courtroom was filled with a collective gasp, a ripple of surprise and disbelief. It was done. It was over. Henry Bennett had been held accountable for his actions. As the judge continued, Emma's focus shifted. She didn't need to hear the rest of the verdict. She knew what had just happened. Her mind was spinning with the relief, the overwhelming sense of triumph. She had done it. She had won. But as she stood there, a strange feeling washed over her, a feeling she hadn't expected. It wasn't just satisfaction. It wasn't just relief. It was something more complicated, something that lingered in her chest. She had fought for this moment, had worked tirelessly for it. And now that it had come, she realized that she wasn't sure what to do with it. Henry, on the other hand, was a picture of defeat. His eyes were downcast, his body still. The pride, the arrogance that had once defined him were gone. He was no longer the officer who had strutted through life with a sense of entitlement. He was a man who had lost everything: his career, his reputation, his sense of self. The truth had come crashing down on him, and there was no escaping it. His world had crumbled, and he had no one to blame but himself. The judge called for order in the court, and the room began to settle. But Emma's mind was still racing. She had done what she set out to do, but now, the weight of everything she had endured in the past year, everything that had led her to this moment, settled heavily on her shoulders. She had fought back against Henry's abuse. She had stood up for herself, for the people who had been wronged, and she had won. But she couldn't help but feel a strange emptiness, a sense that the battle wasn't truly over, that there was more to this story than the courtroom. The trial had been won, but the war, she realized, was far from finished. The courtroom buzzed with the sound of reporters furiously scribbling notes, jurors exchanging glances, and spectators quietly murmuring to one another. Emma stood still for a moment, taking in the weight of the moment, the gravity of what had just transpired. She had won. She had successfully held Henry Bennett accountable for his actions. But the emotions she had anticipated, the relief, the satisfaction, did not come as easily as she thought they would. Instead, a quiet emptiness filled her chest, and she found herself standing frozen in place, unsure of what to do next. It wasn't that she regretted anything. On the contrary, she was proud of what she had achieved, proud of the way she had fought with everything she had. This was what justice was supposed to look like, wasn't it? Officer Bennett had abused his position of power, humiliated others for his own gain, and used his badge as a tool of oppression. And now, he had been held accountable for it. But somehow, the victory felt hollow, as if there was something missing. The gavel echoed through the courtroom, signaling the end of the trial. Emma snapped out of her reverie, her mind coming back into focus. The judge was speaking, and Emma turned her attention toward him, listening intently. She had done her part. Now, it was up to the system to enforce the consequences, to ensure that Henry would not be able to hurt anyone else again. "Officer Bennett," the judge said, addressing Henry, his voice steady but firm, "you are found guilty of misconduct. Your actions have caused harm to multiple individuals, and you are hereby stripped of your position as a law enforcement officer. You will face the consequences of your actions, as determined by the legal system." The courtroom was silent as the judge's words sank in. Henry's face remained unreadable, his expression a mixture of defeat and disbelief. His eyes were fixed on the floor, unable to look up at anyone in the room. He had lost everything. The career he had worked so hard to build, the reputation he had once been so proud of. His sense of self was now in ruins. There was nothing left to protect him. The weight of the truth had crushed him, and there was no escaping the consequences. Emma's heart pounded in her chest as she watched the scene unfold. She had anticipated the outcome, but now that it was here, the reality of it felt surreal. She had spent so long preparing for this moment, and yet, standing here now, she wasn't sure what to feel. She had fought for justice, and she had won. But for some reason, the victory didn't feel as satisfying as she had imagined it would. Her mind drifted back to the beginning of the trial, to the day when she had first stepped into the courtroom, filled with uncertainty and fear. She had been just another young lawyer, trying to prove herself in a world that didn't always make it easy for someone like her to succeed. But now, after months of hard work, after countless hours of preparation, she had emerged victorious. She had faced the man who had once humiliated her, the man who had torn apart her life, and she had won. But the reality of it was bittersweet. The victory had come at a cost. It had come with the reminder of the pain and humiliation she had endured at his hands. And now that the trial was over, that pain didn't magically disappear. It lingered, a shadow hanging over her, reminding her of everything she had been through to get to this point. The courtroom slowly began to empty as reporters filed out to write their stories. Jurors stood and stretched, and the judge adjourned for the day. Emma remained seated for a moment, lost in thought. She had done what she set out to do. She had exposed the truth. She had fought for justice. And she had won. But now, she was left to face the aftermath. What came next? What was the next step in her journey? The answer, she realized, was not as simple as she had hoped. She had spent so much time focusing on the trial, on winning the case, that she had neglected to think about what would happen afterward. The sense of closure she had anticipated was nowhere to be found. Instead, she was left standing in the quiet aftermath, unsure of how to move forward. As Emma gathered her things and prepared to leave the courtroom, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out and saw that it was a message from Sarah. "I saw the verdict. You did it, Emma. I'm so proud of you," the message read. Emma smiled faintly, feeling a wave of warmth spread through her. Sarah had been with her through everything. The long nights of studying, the sleepless hours spent preparing for the trial, and the emotional roller coaster that had been the last few weeks. Sarah had been there, offering support when Emma needed it most. And now, even in the midst of her mixed emotions, Emma couldn't help but feel a sense of gratitude toward her best friend. "Thanks, Sarah," Emma replied, her fingers typing the words slowly. "It's over now, but I'm not sure what comes next." There was a brief pause before Sarah's response came through. "You'll figure it out. You've always figured it out. And you've made such a difference. I'm so proud of you. No matter what happens next, you've done something amazing." Emma leaned back in her chair, staring at her phone for a moment. Sarah was right, of course. Emma had made a difference. She had fought for justice, and she had won. But now, she realized that her journey wasn't over. This trial, this case, was just one chapter in a much larger story. The battle for justice didn't end with one victory. It was a lifelong fight, one that required constant vigilance, constant action. Emma knew that, deep down. With a deep breath, Emma stood up from her seat and walked out of the courtroom. The familiar hum of the city outside greeted her as she stepped into the sunlight, but it felt different now. The weight of the victory, the burden of everything she had fought for, was still heavy on her shoulders. But as she took a step forward, she couldn't help but feel a sense of purpose, stronger than ever. Her journey had only just begun. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the streets as Emma made her way home. The weight of the day hung heavily on her shoulders, but it was a different kind of weight than she was used to. It wasn't the weight of the battle, the crushing pressure of a courtroom fight. This was the weight of accomplishment, of knowing that, for once, she had done exactly what she set out to do. But as the soft breeze rustled the leaves of the trees lining the sidewalk, Emma felt an unfamiliar quietness within herself. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, and she pulled it out, expecting another message from Sarah. But this time, it was an unfamiliar number. She hesitated for a moment before swiping the screen to open the message. "Emma, it's Henry." Emma stopped in her tracks, her heart skipping a beat. Henry. The man she had fought so hard against, the man who had humiliated her and countless others. She had won the trial. He had been held accountable. So why was he reaching out now? A wave of mixed emotions washed over her. Part of her wanted to ignore the message, to leave him in the past where he belonged. But another part of her felt a strange pull to understand what he had to say. "Can we talk?" The message continued. "I owe you an apology." Emma stared at the screen for a long moment, her mind racing. Apologize? After everything? The arrogance, the cruelty, the way he had dismissed her, destroyed her sense of dignity in that courtroom. She could feel the anger rising in her chest as she thought about the years she had spent dealing with the trauma his actions had caused. But something inside her, something deeper, kept her from responding with anger. Instead, she exhaled slowly, as if releasing the tension that had been building since the moment she received the message. She tapped her phone, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. Was she ready to hear him out? After everything, was it worth it? She hesitated, but ultimately typed back. What do you want to say?" The response came quickly, almost as if Henry had been waiting for her reply. "I've been thinking a lot about everything that's happened. I'm not asking for forgiveness, Emma. I just want you to know that I see now what I did. I see how wrong I was. And I wanted to say, I'm sorry. Not for the court, not for the case, but for everything I did to you and the people I hurt. I know I can't undo it, but I need you to know that I regret it. I've been trying to make things right in my own way, and I'm starting to realize just how much damage I've caused. I don't expect anything from you. I just need you to know that I've changed." Emma's thumb hovered over the screen. She read the message several times, the weight of his words sinking in. Change. Could he really have changed? She thought back to all the moments during the trial when she had seen him squirm, when she had seen cracks in the walls of his defense. The arrogant, unrepentant man she had once known had been replaced by someone who was willing to face the consequences of his actions. But could she believe it? For so long, she had been consumed by the need for justice, by the desire to expose the truth. And she had done that. But what came after the victory? What came after the courtroom doors closed and the applause faded? What happened when you were forced to face the human side of the people involved in the fight? Emma had spent so long focused on the trial that she hadn't considered what her own personal growth would look like once it was over. The phone buzzed again. "I know it doesn't change anything," the message continued, "but I just wanted to say thank you for making me face what I did. I didn't think I could, but I'm learning that I need to. And I'm sorry." Emma felt her breath catch in her throat. She had never expected this. She had fought so hard to expose the truth, to make Henry pay for the harm he had caused. But now that he was facing it, was it enough? She thought about everything she had gone through, the humiliation, the sleepless nights, the anger and frustration. She thought about all the people who had been hurt by his actions, people who would never get back the time he had taken from them. And she thought about herself, about the woman who had been afraid to speak out, to stand up, but who now stood stronger than ever before. Her thumb hovered over the screen again. Was she ready to forgive him? Could she? Was forgiveness even the point? She had fought for justice, and justice had been served. That was what mattered. But somewhere deep inside her, she felt something shift. It wasn't forgiveness she was looking for, not from him, not from anyone. It was closure, the chance to move on, to truly let go of the past. She typed back, her fingers trembling slightly. "I appreciate your message, Henry. I won't forget what you did, but I won't carry that anger with me either. I've moved on from who you were. I've done what I needed to do for myself, for the people you hurt, and for my own peace. I hope you continue to work on making things right, not just for me, but for everyone you wronged." She pressed send, letting out a long breath as she stared at the screen. She didn't know what to expect next, but she felt lighter, as if she had made a decision, taken another step forward. As she walked the final stretch toward her apartment, the weight on her shoulders seemed to lessen. The victory in court, the validation of her years of hard work, felt as if it had been placed in its proper place. It had been a battle, and she had won it. But now, life was calling her to move forward, to create a future that was no longer defined by the past. She entered her apartment, the familiar scent of home filling the air. She kicked off her shoes and sat down at her desk, where she had spent so many sleepless nights preparing for the trial. The silence in the room felt comforting, almost peaceful. She had spent so long focused on the fight, on the struggle, that she hadn't taken the time to reflect on what it all meant. She had spent years building her career, her purpose, but now it was time to think about the next chapter. The phone buzzed again. It was Sarah. "Proud of you, Emma. I knew you'd make a difference. Now, take a break. You deserve it." Emma smiled as she replied, "Thanks, Sarah. I think I'm ready for that break." And for the first time in a long while, Emma felt a sense of peace. She had faced her demons, fought for what was right, and come out victorious. And now, it was time to turn the page and see what the next chapter had in store. As she sat there, looking out the window at the city stretching out before her, Emma realized that this was just the beginning. There was still so much more to do, so many battles to fight, so many injustices to correct. But for now, she could rest easy, knowing that she had done something meaningful, something that would make a difference. The journey was far from over, but she was ready for whatever came next.